Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for joining us, both in person and live streaming. My name is Shannon Hines, and I'm the Vice President of External Relations and Enrollment here at Georgian, and I am your MC for this afternoon. We'll begin with our Indigenous land acknowledgement. We share one at the start of all college events to honor the land and in recognition of the traditional territory of the Indigenous peoples who call the land home. We also share one to demonstrate our commitment to truth and reconciliation as treaty people. There are 46 treaties covering Ontario and 6 treaties governing the land of Georgian catchment areas. I encourage you to take time to learn about each one. Georgian acknowledges that all campuses are situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people. The Anishinaabe include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Georgian is dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. This week, Georgian Days, is an opportunity for us to come together as a college community to celebrate, connect, and learn something new. Many activities and events have been planned to mark the end of another amazing academic year and to recognize the incredible achievements of Team Georgian. This morning, I had the absolute pleasure to MC the Board of Governors Awards of Distinction, which celebrate Georgian employees, alumni, and community partners who have made an outstanding contribution to the college and demonstrate an ongoing commitment to excellence. Here to tell us a bit more is Richard C. Gauthier, Chair of the Board of Governors, and Kevin Weaver, our President and CEO.
Well, good afternoon, Team Georgian. G'day! Just want to make sure you're awake. It's dark back there, so. It is my honor to bring greetings and gratitude on behalf of the Board of Governors, and I want to thank you all for what you do in support of the college and our students to deliver an unrivaled learning experience. Each year, the Board of Governors has the challenging task of selecting the recipients for the awards of distinction that Shannon just mentioned, and we continue to be impressed by the nominations we receive and by their exceptional quality. Now, while many of you here were in the audience this morning or watching via live stream, we thought we'd take this opportunity to invite those of you who are here now this afternoon to come and join Kevin and I up on stage for a group photo. So I'd invite you to come up, please, to do that. And for the rest of you, I'm going to put you to work. Let's give them a loud, grizzly cheer. Here we go.
Wonderful. Congratulations again to all our winners, and thank you all for joining us. Ani Sego Tanshe, which means hello in Ojibwe, Mohawk, and Métis. As Georgian's president, I'm personally committed to truth and reconciliation, and in sharing an Indigenous greeting and closing in my remarks is just one small step that I've been taking on my journey. I encourage you all to pause and think about how you can move forward in the spirit of reconciliation in a way that's meaningful to you. Congratulations once again to our fantastic group of teams and individuals who joined us on stage, who were recognized this morning by our Board of Governors. You truly do model excellence, and we thank you for that. Your ongoing commitment, passion, leadership, and willingness to go above and beyond is an inspiration to all of us. I was personally taken back as I learned more about the stories this morning of our winners. I get to read the nominations package, but when you see the videos and then we heard the remarks from the winners this morning, it just adds more depth to the story and the narrative. And I have to tell you, I was not only inspired, but I'm quite humbled. I kind of said to a few of my colleagues, it makes you think, like, what did I do last week or the week before to make the world a better place? When you hear stories like that, it's truly inspiring. We're so proud of all you've achieved and providing transformative teaching, learning, and working environment here at the college. So, Chi Miigwech, thank you for that. As our recipients made their way back to their seats, I was reflecting on how proud I am as the president and CEO of this great organization, because the one thing we know, well, we can only recognize a few, and I want to thank those that nominated for the awards. We know how hard all of you work to support our students. Post-secondary education, as we know, is really a 3-semester, and we're just getting ready next week. We're doing some orientation Friday for our summer semester. We're a year-round operation. We have complexities like never before. And we thought, yes, the pandemic was complex, and now we're in a different state of complexity with flex and hybrid learning and experiences. So it makes me reflect on the tremendous accomplishments of Team Georgian. So all of you, both with us here and those watching via live stream, thank you. Thank you for your contributions, because you're making a difference, and it's making the difference in the lives of our students. Georgian's mission is to inspire innovation and transform lives, and each of you help us do that. Fundamentally, when you think of our mission, it truly is about hope. Hope that we provide our students and graduates with knowledge and skills that they need to go on for fulfilling and rewarding lives and careers. Hope that they become compassionate citizens and change makers who create a stronger, sustainable, more equitable, and inclusive society. Hope that, with our support, our industry and community partners strengthen and grow our region and economy. Hope that we can make a positive difference collectively as an organization and individually as the people who make up this great college. Our theme for today's keynote is Hope Forward, steadying our steps after a challenging season. This reflects the optimism I feel as your president about our future and about the work that you're doing to lead us there. One that we'll continue to co-create together. We don't know what the future will hold. We're still trying to figure out some things as we work our way through living with the pandemic. But I do know that we'll be successful if we do it together. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robin Handley-Defoe. Described as one of the most sought-after, engaging, thought-provoking, and truly transformative international speakers and scholars in her field, Robin is a multi-award-winning education and psychology instructor, author, and resiliency expert. With over 18 years of university teaching and research experience, Robin offers accessible and practical strategies grounded in global research that help foster and cultivate resiliency and wellness within ourselves and others. Robin recently joined a group of highly esteemed authors from around the globe as a 2022 Nautilus Award recipient for her debut book, Calm Within the Storm, A Pathway to Everyday Resiliency. And we were just chatting earlier, and I know she's got a book coming out very soon, her next book, so stay tuned for that. I will admit I'm a personal fan. I've heard Robin speak many times, so I know we're in for a real treat. So without further ado, let's give Robin a warm Grizzly welcome.
Beautiful. So good afternoon, everyone. How are you all doing today? We're okay? We're doing good? Okay. So we're going to have a wee little chat for the next hour about resiliency and wellness. And before we dive into this, I just want to give my sincerest thanks to everyone who organized and facilitated this day and for me to be invited to have part of this conversation. So thank you for the warm welcome. It's a deep honor to be able to come back to Georgian and visit each and every one of you. So whenever I do my work, I always start actually by sharing my contact information, and this actually is my contact information, and I share it because I welcome these conversations to continue. So even after our time together, if you have curiosities or wonderments, or you just want to learn more about some of this work, I just want you to know that this is your invitation to absolutely reach out. I welcome those conversations to continue. And I appreciate we acknowledge the land that we are on today, and where I've done most of my research is land of the Anishinaabe First Persons of the Mississauga. That's treaty territory as well. I'm a settler in that space, and I give thanks that we're able to live and be in community and to be able, for me in particular, to raise my family in that area, which is also known as Peterborough, Ontario. So we're literally neighbors, like we're totally neighbors, and that's where I get to call home. And I'm a guest in this territory, and I'm appreciative to be here today. So to get us started, I want to let you know, so we've been doing research, obviously, for the last wee while to figure out how are people doing, what's kind of going on in different types of industries and different backgrounds, how are people feeling? And we actually asked this research question a wee while ago when we said, if you had to sum up with one word what your most predominant feeling is on any given day, what would you use? And you can even ask yourself that, what word would you use to sum all of this up? And what we found was quite remarkable. The number one kind of response we got back was the word done. They're like, Robin, we're done. That's my word, I am done. And it wasn't done, I got all my work done. It was not that. It wasn't done, I finished Netflix, right? It wasn't done, I finished the internet. It was, I have nothing more to give. It was just this kind of idea of deep depletion. And often what happens in our professional work, usually we can kind of lean into our personal life, and that gives us that little bit extra momentum or endurance. Or if things are kind of complicated at home, we can lean into our work and get a bit of a reprieve. But what we saw over these last wee whiles is that things were complicated everywhere. So we didn't have any area of refuge, any place to seek out just some kind of a bit of a break. And what we thought was actually quite interesting, we followed up that question a little while later, and we asked people, okay, well, what do you need from your leaders? If you're feeling so depleted as leaders, what can we do? What is it? And of course, there's lots of conversation about retention and how do we make sure people are okay and what do they need to stay? And again, this is what I love about action research. We were blown away with the results because people said, oh, do you know what I need, Robin? I need to be recognized as an adult. That's all I need. It's well, we can do that, right, as leaders in groups. And what does that actually mean? It means I can handle difficult conversations, just have them with me, right? Ask me how I'm doing. Let's just get to actual real conversations. And again, these are things that I find really encouraging because we are a weary bunch, but now I feel as though we're asking really good questions of what is it that we need. And on that note, I'll share with you kind of our first little check-in and check-up, is to ask you, even in this moment, do you need comfort or solutions? I can tell you with radical candor, being able to say to somebody, in this moment, I actually need comfort right now, is remarkable. And I'll give you an example. So I'm a mom of 3 teenagers, 19, 17, and 15. And a wee while ago, Ava came home. She's my middle, right? So I have boys on either side, Ava's in the middle, and she came home, and she was in a bit of a mood. So if anybody recognizes a 17-year-old mood, that's what she brought home. And the boys literally disappeared. Like the boys were just like, where did everybody go? I was standing by myself in the kitchen and they were there a minute ago. And then all of a sudden it was just me and Ava. And I'm like, girl, what do you need? Do you need comfort or do you need a solution right now? And she's like, Mama, I need you to sit down beside me and I need you to hate math as much as I do. And I was like, all right, I can do that. So I pulled up the bar stool and sat beside her and we commiserated about who will ever need to know this. Like really, let's be honest. And then after we kind of worked through some of those feelings, I said, girl, what happened today? Where did this come from? And she said, Mom, I was so embarrassed by math today. And I said, okay, tell me a little bit more. She said, I was in English class, grade 11 English. And the teacher said, stand up and tell us the last book you read that made you cry. And Ava said, calculus. And everyone was laughing at her. And she's like, no, for legit, it was calculus. It was not Colleen Hoover. It was not Twilight. It literally was calculus. And she just had this moment where she's just like, I'm so frustrated. Now, what's really remarkable is if Ava had came into that space and she said, I had a bad day today with math. And I said, okay, solution mode, let's get you a tutor. Let's figure this out. I would have shut down her feelings. And that kind of idea of like, what is it that we need right now is we need to be seen. Like we need people to recognize like we're doing the best we can with the tools and the energy and the resources. But on the flip side, there's some days where our emotions feel so heavy that if someone showed you even an ounce of compassion, you would burst into tears. And you're like, don't be nice to me, just give me the solution, right? Because you're literally just holding it together. So even just knowing what is it that we need, what is it that we need in the moment is a way to start to hope forward, to be honest with ourselves. And again, just that clarity. We will talk a lot about why clarity is so important. Now, in my work, we often talk about this idea that so often as high performers and professionals like yourselves, there's this propensity that we do all the things, right? We carry all the work. And just because we carry it well, that doesn't mean it's not heavy. There's enormous amounts of invisible labor that goes into being like a responsible grown-up right now. And I think there's also a lot of pressure, especially in academic settings, that we feel that we have to make all of this look easy, right? We just show up every day and it's like, oh, look at me go. But meanwhile, there again, that invisible labor is a lot for some persons. So again, it's just that recognition that we've gone through a lot, we've grown through a lot, and where we get to go from here, that's the pretty exciting part because we get to co-create these futures. We get to decide how we're going to show up, and we're having really open conversations that 3 years ago we weren't having about mental health and life with work balance and integration. Like we're having these big conversations and coming up with new ways of doing things, which we talk about in the research as the big opportunity. So this is that big opportunity when we get to decide, hey, we're going to show up perhaps in a different way, a way that might be actually keeping us more steady and grounded. Now, to be in a place of being steady and grounded, we know it involves resiliency, right? Because we're going to get walloped. We're going to have difficult days. We're going to have some days when we don't feel like doing it. Or on the other side, we might be navigating complex things. Like right now, we're celebrating Mental Health Awareness Week, and I'm sure you've probably heard the statistic that 1 in 5 people are impacted by mental health. But the reality is actually everyone is, because we all know somebody who experiences mental health. We're all impacted by mental health, and our resiliency needs to be nurtured and fostered. Now, when I started this research on human resiliency, I asked that question, why do some people give up when life gets hard, and other people get up? Like other people like find a way to persist, and other people, they stay really stuck. And we know what people look like when they're stuck. They just can't seem to kind of get over things. They just kind of keep going through these cycles. And what was really fascinating, at the time in the research, a lot of folks were talking about grit, right? They were saying mental toughness is the key to resiliency. Now, when I went out into the field and started to work with some of the most resilient persons I could ever imagine, through the Middle East, all through Central America, all across Canada and the United States, and I met resilient persons, and I would ask them, tell me about your grit. Tell me about your mental stamina and toughness. And the most common response I would get back is, Robin, I don't think I'm particularly tough. I'm actually not really good at dealing with things. I'm not good at problem solving, and I don't do emotions well. Yet these people were going through these remarkable seasons of their life and coming out on the other side of it. So what was fascinating, we kind of jumped back into that research to be like, okay, well, why does everybody think it's about toughness and grit? One key contributor to that, the books, the research, was mostly done by Navy SEALs, right? Those are a very particular group of people, right? They are a very particular group of people in terms of how they face challenges. Now, I got really curious about, okay, well, this woman I'm working with right now in Honduras, she is clearly resilient. What does she have in common with people in other parts of the world who are also resilient? And that was the origin of where we came up with this work and this theory of everyday resiliency, because we started to see themes that people coast to coast to coast across Canada and overseas and other places, we actually saw that they had similar stories. Now, I'll tell you a wee bit about each one of these pillars. Now, the first one's belonging. You need to have a home team. Like, you actually need someone in your corner that no matter what is going to stand by you. Now, it doesn't have to be the same person for your whole life, but in every season in your life, you need one caring, consistent person. Someone you can, even if you screwed up, they will tell you, you screwed up, and I will stand with you, right? They're going to even stay with you in the hard seasons. And also, when you've done really well, they celebrate alongside you, right? They're the phone call when things are not great, but they're also that phone call when things are positive. You need a home team. And what we know about home teams is it's where we get this foundation of trust and psychological safety. It's one of those things where it's like, no matter what happens, I know I'm going to be able to be okay because of my home team. Now, the second thing we learned about these resilient persons was they were able to maintain perspective. Now, perspective is quite fickle, right? On some days we have it in droves, we have lots of perspective, and other days we have very little of perspective. But what we learned is that perspective really is about having our head and our heart in alignment, being able to operate from our values and being able to problem solve and work through things. Now, I'll share with you a perspective lesson that I learned, and as with most lessons I learned, they're quite painful. I have yet to learn things in a not painful way, I'm quite convinced. It's like win or learn, and that's how I keep figuring this out. But it was actually several years ago when my oldest son was in grade 9. Okay, and when Hunter was in grade 9, he came to me that morning at breakfast and said, Mama, I have a basketball game after school, and I need you to be there. And I was like, I will be there. And I was even basking in the fact that he still wanted his mama at the game, right? Because I thought, I still have, I matter. This is great. I walked into my campus and even told everybody in the office, I'm leaving early today because Hunter has a basketball game, and I'm going to make sure to be there. And everyone was like, oh, that's great. And as I was leaving at the end of the day to make that game, I had a student stop by and said, hey, can I ask you, Professor, a question about the assignment? I'm like, of course, I'm going to answer you. And then one of my colleagues said, about this meeting tomorrow, can we just go over that presentation real quick? I'm like, no problem. And then somebody else asked me to sign something. Now, by the time I was able to get out of the office and get to the high school, it was in the 4th quarter, okay? So you don't need to know a lot about basketball other than that's very close to the end. I was just relieved. I literally felt relief that I made it. At the end of the match, Hunter comes up into the stands, and he said to me, he goes, Mom, I'm so glad you made it. I'm like, dude, I would not have missed this. And he said, I have one question for you, though. Have you ever been late to teach? And I said, dude, I can't be late to teach because that's important. Yeah, I said that to a 14-year-old boy. And in that moment, as soon as that came out, I'm like, I didn't mean it like that. And he said, you know what? This is how it's going to go. He said, you have 4 years to make it up to me. He said, I need you to get on board. He's like, these years will go by fast. I'll give you 4 years to make this up to me. He's like, I need to know that you tell me I'm number one, but I need you to show me, and that family does come first. Now, I remember in that moment feeling like schooled by a 14-year-old boy, And just, I felt this deep gratitude that he was right, that I still had 4 years to make it up to him. And that's perspective, right? Learning in that moment what matters most, and we make it matter most. Now, the third thing we learned about resilient persons is they have the capacity for acceptance. Now, acceptance is challenging because we don't like what we don't like, and things aren't always fair, and things don't always make sense. We in North America are raised in systems that talk about what's called just world theory. Now, just world theory says this: if you follow those golden rules and you do everything right, you should have positive outcomes. And the opposite, if you don't make good choices and you don't show up, then you should probably have negative consequences. But as we all know, the world doesn't work like that. You can have somebody who makes poor choices all the way along, and they seem to get through life unscathed. And then horrible things happen to good people. So we're kind of in this kind of trap where we're trained and we're told, it's like, okay, if you do it right, then you'll have good outcomes. But there's so much that's outside of our control. So learning about acceptance is essentially finding ways to first decipher our controllables. Like, what is within our control? What's outside of our control? And then how do we find ways to coexist with things that are outside of our control? And what that really comes down to is sometimes persisting through some of the discomfort, some of the things that don't make sense. And often we know when we're kind of stuck in this trying to make sense of it, when we ask a lot of why questions. Why did that person get promoted? Or why did that opportunity present to that person? Or why does that person kind of get away with all of this? That's a really deep external focus. The shift is to ask kind of like, what do I do now? What's my next right move? So when things happen that we don't necessarily agree with or like, it's not that we're complacent. It's we ask, okay, well, what's my role here? What's within my control? How do I show up for this? Now, the fourth thing we learned about resilient persons was the power of hope and choosing to live hope-filled. Now, I appreciate in Kevin's remarks how about hope is important, right? This is so important that we are hope dealers to let people know better days are ahead. We need to trust that better days are ahead and we can figure these things out. And a wee while ago, I was in California in a really large venue, and there was a very well-known CEO, which most of you would recognize, I'm sure. And I got up and I said, hope is a strategy going into 2023, and I'll tell you why. And this CEO said, he literally stood up and he's like, no, hope is not a strategy. And I turned to him, I'm like, hey, I'm going first. Like, this is my turn. And I'm like, let me tell you why hope is a strategy. And it's a strategy on a physiological level, all right? Now, where I learned that hope is a strategy was actually work I had done with our members of our military, our Canadian military. And I remember years ago working with a group of soldiers who had just come home from a deployment. And I was super curious, what do soldiers look forward to? If you've been deployed for all of these months and you're finally home, what are you going to do next? So I did all my protocols, but then I asked them. And the first soldier said to me, he said, before I deployed, I started to paint my kitchen, but I only got half done. But now that I'm home, I'm going to finish painting my kitchen. That feels peculiar, right? The next soldier's like, yeah, I started to put hardwood floor down at my house, but I only got half done. Now that I'm home, I'll finish the rest of the hardwood floor project. So all of these members of the military in this platoon had half-finished house projects. So I asked their lieutenant, respectfully, and I said, sir, why do all your soldiers have half-finished house projects? What's that about? And what he said was so significant. Doc, my soldiers leave half-finished house projects as signs of hope for their families that they're coming back. That they leave evidence on the ground that there's still work to be done here too, and they'll come back and finish it. Now, I said to that very weathered lieutenant, I said, sir, you're suggesting that hope is a choice. And he said, Robin, if you want to be in service in any capacity in your life, you'll always have to find your own ways to stay hope-filled, because no one can do that work for you. You'll have to find your own strategies to trust that better days are ahead. We wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't believe that. So my gentle invitation to each and every one of you here is, how do you keep yourself hope-filled? Because there's a lot of negativity and there's a lot of noise, and we're seeing it especially in our emerging adults. Now, adulthood is such a long season now that they've broken up into mini seasons, right? So emerging adulthood is kind of talked about in the research from like 17 to 25, right? They're almost getting there. And what's really interesting is that particular emerging adult, this is an era of anxiety for them. They feel like they won't be able to afford a home. They don't feel as though they'll have opportunities. The world is on fire, global warming, climate change, like all of these things. Since they were little, they've been told that the world is unwell, and they're feeling a lot of anxiety. And we're seeing that correlation with mental health, right? We see our students are struggling carrying the weight of the world in just their two hands, trying their best to figure it all out. And what happens is that they need someone to hold the line and say, yeah, there's a lot of noise and a lot of negativity, but there's some things that are steadfast. There's some things like being of service, right? Your character, your values, those are the things that will always see you through. Like, people need to let them know that, yes, get your hopes up. It's time to get your hopes up again. And what hurts my heart so often is how many children and teenagers and emerging adults are told, don't get your hopes up, right? We have to have them get their hopes up so that way we can forge our futures in a way that is actually a sense of optimism and what's possible, what could go right, versus focusing on what's not okay. Now, the last thing we learned about the resiliency of these 5 pillars was the power of humor. Now, we actually learned that resilient people are kind of funny, but they also have a wee bit of a dark streak, right? Like, there's certain people they should not sit beside in certain events, right? Like it's one of those things where it was kind of, wow, what was that all about? And what was interesting is we thought of a lot of it was like deflection, right? Like not taking it seriously, right? Like they're just kind of casting things away. But then we learned that there was actually a biological underpinning as to why they were doing it. So for example, when you laugh, your body releases a natural tranquilizer. So for that moment in time, you cannot feel pain. So again, that doesn't solve your problems, but it does give you just these little moments of reprieve for you to like catch your breath, ground, and like choose again. And in historical times, they used to refer to this as gallows humor. So as people were being marched to the gallows, they were having a good time, right? That's probably not when you think they'd be having a good time, right? This was not going to end well for them. Yet they were dancing and having a great time. And then all of a sudden it was like everyone said, well, that was lunacy. It's like, or it was the biological system knowing that it literally was just trying to pump their bodies full of that kind of that numbing agent, that tranquilizer, because they couldn't control their fate. Now, another interesting thing we have learned along that vein of humor and the power of humor, and I sometimes get just a wee bit nervous because this is what I get referenced for the most as a scholar. We learned this about this component. People who swear, okay, now not at somebody, it needs to be more of a floating adjective type of a cuss word, okay? Are you ready for this? You probably will like this. They live longer. Yeah, there's quite a bit of hope for many of us. Yeah, quite a bit of hope. Well, how come people who swear live longer, right? It's not kale, it's not yoga, right? It's like, how are they still here? These cranky old people, like, how are they still here? What's that about? And what we learned is it actually had a connection and a correlation with their temperament. So people who swear have a tendency of just kind of being what we call flowers. They just kind of let things go. Versus the opposite temperament, which is brewing or bottling. And they like hold on to everything. I was recently working with a group of senior leaders, and one was sharing that he was offended in the workplace. And he told me what happened, and I listened. And then I asked, what did you do next? And he said, Robin, I told myself, I will never forget this for as long as I live. I was like, wow, that was a commitment statement. And then I said, so in like 2 years, you're going to call me and say, like, Robin, how do I get over this, right? And he's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, you literally told your brain, we are not going to let this go, which means eventually you're going to be in a situation of, how do I let this go? But you literally programmed it in your brain that you will not let it go, right? So it's this kind of idea that we have these like flowers who just kind of roll with things a wee bit more versus the people that bottle it up and brew. And what we found is that that temperament of just kind of like not taking everything so personal or so serious actually increased their immune system, right? They were actually not wasting their resources trying to navigate some of that negative, kind of that toxic memory. They were able to stay in more positive state. So what we learned in that work was those 5 variables work together to create this like constellation of what people could lean into. Having that home team, having perspective, recognizing there's some things that are going to be outside of my control and they don't make sense, and also choosing to lean into hope and actually having a wee bit of fun in the process is actually what helps people get through hard times. Now, one of the questions I get often asked is, okay, Robin, if I have those things at play, why is it that I don't always feel very resilient? Or why is it that it seems like some days I'm more resilient than others? And the barrier that we often talk about that's universal is this thing called stress. Have you heard of stress before? Yeah. Has anyone heard it's going to kill them? Has anyone heard that? Yeah. It used to be margarine. Margarine was going to wipe us out as a species. Yeah. Margarine and aspartame. As long as you could have got through the 80s without those things, you had a good trajectory for life expectancy. But now, and this is where that era of anxiety from our teenagers is coming from, because everything is dangerous. Everything is scary. And it's really hard, especially when you're parenting or supporting young children, the difference between risk, play, and danger. Like, yeah, we have to keep our kids out of danger, but we're also not even letting children take natural risks anymore, right? I remember one time, Ava, when she was a little one, she wanted to cross the street to go visit her best friend who lived down the block. And I sat her down, I'm like, okay, so people are texting, they're not gonna watch you, they're gonna hit you with their cars, watch out for SUVs, they won't be able to see below you. And I gave her this whole ream of how to walk across the road safely. And then all of a sudden she exhaled, she's like, actually, I'm good. And I'm like, no, Emmy's waiting for you, not worth it. Right? Because and again, I was trying to parent, right? Because I wanted to let her know about the dangers of SUVs and texting drivers and the fact that you're going to get squished, right? And she was just like, yeah, I'm good. I'm just going to stay in my room because that sounds dangerous out there, right? So they're growing up in this system where everything is a threat. Everything is dangerous. But we actually need a wee bit of risk to actually keep us growing, to kind of work outside of our comfort zones. And when we think about stress, and this is my favorite bell curve. Do other people have a favorite bell curve? Yeah, they're like, oh, that's a dinner party conversation bell curve. I'm a deep fan of the Yerk-Dodson human performance stress curve because to me, it was just, I remember being an undergrad and learning about it and just thinking like, this makes sense because this isn't new. It's been around since 1908. But what it talks about is that we have like ways of interacting with stress that actually sets us up for how we behave or we perform. So just that we're all on the same page, stress is a hormone, okay? It's called cortisol. Our body makes it to essentially ignite behavior, okay? It gives us this kind of fuel. And if we didn't have any cortisol, okay, we would be in this place called low affect or what's called the comfort zone, right? It doesn't take a lot of effort to stay here. Things are pretty chill, which is great. But after a while, we don't feel very good about ourselves, right? We actually start to feel kind of despondent. But then we have things where we have more responsibility, more things that we have to do, and more goals, and then all of a sudden we start to get into this zone of what we call growth and learning. And this means that we have enough cortisol in our bloodstream that we have energy and focus, right? It's this kind of way that we're like, okay, this is important, I'm showing up, and it feels really good. And even just take a moment to think about when you're on your A game. When you're on your best and you're feeling the most effective, chances are there's a little bit of pressure, right? There's kind of things that matter, and it feels as though you have the capacity to do it. But the reality about stress is one dose of stress is not going to be an issue. It's the compounding doses of stress or cortisol that is actually making us sick. Okay, so it's the amount of doses of cortisol we get on a daily basis. And when we start to get them, we move into this zone called distress. So all of that starts to fill up our bloodstream, and then we cross this threshold where all of a sudden now everything feels like really effortful, and we're not very productive. We feel tired or fatigued a lot of the time because our body is actually trying to slow down. Our body's trying to shut down and to recover, yet we just push it harder. And as high performers, it's really helpful to notice, when are you feeling like fatigued versus exhausted? Because when you're fatigued, a good night's sleep, a lovely meal with a loved one, a good book, that can just kind of bring you back, right? You're like, oh, I needed that. But what's happening now is I hear people saying, Robin, I'm trying to do all the things that I used to do, but I still don't feel any better. This self-care isn't sticking. Like, yeah, it feels better in the moment, but as soon as you go back behind the desk, it's like, now I lost it, right? It just isn't getting that kind of traction that it usually does, which is a sign that we're likely in that place of exhaustion. And exhaustion is so important to address because that runs the risk of burnout. Now, I'll share with you two really big ideas that we learned about burnout in the last 3 years. The first one is burnout is not a skill deficit. It's not that people don't know that they need to slow down, disconnect, take rest. It's not that. Burnout very much was the curse of the strong. It was the people who are all things to all persons and just kept doing it. They just kept showing up and not taking the time they needed to recharge. They were the best of us. And the second thing we learned about burnout, it wasn't related to the work. Burnout was related to time spent outside of your values. Time spent outside of your values leads to burnout. So the example we use is, let's say you're caring for an elderly parent, but because of the circumstances, you can't get them to their meetings or you can't get them to their appointments. And then you carry that weight of the fact that you feel like you let them down, right? Or you miss some of those sporting events, or you're not showing up for your friends or your loved ones the way you used to. That is actually what makes people feel burned out. It's not the actual work people are doing in the workplace. It's time outside of our values. So the question is how do we get back into our values? How do we do those effortful things that actually make us feel better, that makes us feel like essentially we're good people? Because our values are so associated with, like, I'm a good person who shows up how I want to show up and how my family or my community and my loved ones need me to show up. That's where we actually see the most area where people were burning out. Now, I'm often asked in my work, okay, well, Robin, maybe I'm not burned out, which is good, but I'm over here and I just notice I'm just like really triggered a lot. Like I'm just really kind of raw. What do I do? Now, thankfully, Dr. Kelly McGonigal's research speaks to this. And if you notice you're having a stress response, there's 3 things that you can do. Okay, number 1, get outside. The research shows as soon as you go outside, your body's going to start to re-regulate. Fresh air literally does change your physiology. And even when you leave these buildings today, or at folks watching at home and you go outside, just notice how different you feel as soon as you go outside. Like all of your senses are like, this is different, right? And we actually start to re-regulate. Now I appreciate we can't always get outside when we need to. So thankfully, the second option to get rid of this built-up cortisol is that we can cry. And it's a very particular cry. It's that red, blotchy cry where you get like super snotty and slobbery, right? And afterwards you feel so much better, right? You don't look better, no, but gosh, you feel better, right? It's like, okay, well, what's that about? Well, that's a cortisol cry, and that's literally your body's way of getting rid of all of those toxins. So if you ever wondered, it's like, oh my gosh, why is it that when somebody gives me feedback, I burst into tears? It's just a stress response. It's literally your body just helping you cope in that moment. But it's really hard to say to your students or your senior leader, like, I know we have to have this talk, but I'm just going to cry for like 30 seconds, right? You're going to give me feedback, just let me cry, let me clear the tank. Okay, hit me, right? It doesn't really oode confidence. I get that. So thankfully, the third strategy that we do is that we eat carbohydrates. We eat all of the delicious, yummy, wonderful things. And what's amazing for educators, we actually have identified an eating pattern of behavior called crescendo eating, okay? This is what crescendo eating is. You're not morning breakfasty people, right? A coffee's fine, and you have a few snacks maybe as the day progresses, but my sweet Jesus, by the time you get home at the end of the day, you're ravenous, right? And you're literally like eating croutons like a food group, right? You're eating the goldfish off the floor. Like you literally are like, it's insatiable. You're so hungry. And it's because the fact is you've just had all this cortisol building up all day, and your body has to get rid of it, and that's the quickest way, right? And I remember speaking to one of my colleagues who does, he's a physiologist, and we were talking about how many carbohydrates are we allowed to eat, like not allowed to eat, but do we eat to help metabolize cortisol? And he responded, and he's like, he gave me the measurement in grams. And I'm like, I don't speak that. What is it in Oreo? Like I can understand that as a unit of measurement. And he's like, 1. And I'm like a row? Like, and he was just like, no, it's like 1 is what you would need. But this is what I think happens. You're like feeling overwhelmed, and you have like all of this going on, and then you're just kind of like feeling like loss of hope maybe. And then you have that 1 Oreo at the end of the day or after school, and you're just like, oh, okay, that felt good. I wonder how much more happiness I can find, right? It's like, if I feel this good now, what's that going to be? That's the nirvana at the end of that row. And then we get into these like cycles, right? Where then we feel bad. And again, there's all of these rules, and that's not what this is about. It's recognizing that this is stress behavior. It's not misbehavior, right? And you can never hate yourself healthy. Right? It's this idea that we have to think about how we look after ourselves so we can, again, move ourselves out of that place of distress. Because your distress system, okay, from an evolutionary perspective, this is where you have your fight, flight, which you probably have heard before, right? You fight your way out of trouble or you flee. Yeah, those are familiar. Now, the other two that we don't talk about is freezing. Right? Freezing is when, like, in the moment, you don't even know what to say. But when you're driving home from work 3 hours later, you're like, I could have said that, right? Like, it's almost like afterwards. So that's the third system. And the fourth system that gets awfully neglected is the fawning response. Now, fawning is when your body basically, like, placates, okay? You just acquiesce. And I'll give you an example of a fawning incident. I was supporting a colleague, and she reached out and she goes, Robin, it's time that I resign from my post. Like, I'm done. And I didn't know how much I love supporting people quitting jobs. I had no idea that this was one of the things I really enjoyed doing. So I supported her through this interview process of her exit interview, and I called her the next day, and I said, how did it go? And then there was like a silence on the phone, and she's like, I accepted a promotion. I'm like, that was not the assignment. Like, you were going in there to resign, but in the moment, she literally just took on more work, right? Like, it's literally like her nervous system just kind of abandoned her, and she's like, yeah, I can totally do that. And that's because we're in that season of distress, and this is the big idea I really hope that you hear, is we don't get to pick what physiological reaction we have. Okay, so there's no shame if you're a fawner or a freezer. We don't get to pick to be like, oh, I wish I can, like, get my feistiness and come out as a fighter, or I don't want to fawn. We don't get to pick. Our body will make a decision in terms of what is my best chances of getting out of this situation, right? So it interprets and makes a decision. You don't get to make that decision. And what's really interesting is we think about how sophisticated but also how kind of underdeveloped that system is, right? It's literally just trying to keep you alive. It's not meant for your email, right? Like, you really shouldn't be activating your life or death system to manage your email accounts, right? To manage to-do lists. And that's one of the reasons we're getting so overwhelmed, is because imagine if we had, for example, an encounter every single day with like a bear, right? You're walking out to your car and boom, there's a bear again chasing you, right? I would like to think after 3 or 4 incidences of that, you would make different choices, right? You're like, maybe I shouldn't park there. But instead, we're having these stress responses, and then we just keep giving ourselves more work. And we often talk about the consequence of doing your job really well is you get more work, right? So how do we find ways of working with these nervous systems so we can show up and be well, so we can continue to be well and be of service? Does that make sense so far? Yeah? Beautiful. Okay, so question I wanted to ask you. As a bit of a reset, as we kind of move into some tools and some ideas, my invitation is to ask you, what is your emotional home? Now, your emotional home is essentially the mood or the feeling that you find yourself in most of the time, okay? So for some of us, it could be groundedness and steadiness. That sounds lovely. For most of us, it's things like worrying, right? It doesn't matter what's going on, you're just going to find a place to worry. Or maybe you've met people who their emotional home is anger, and it doesn't matter where they are in the world. They can be looking out at the most beautiful vistas in all of the world, and they're still going to find something to be angry about, right? They're going to still find something that's not good. Now, our emotional home, for many of us in these last 3 years, it's gotten really wobbly, okay? It's gotten really wobbly where there's like so much information and we don't know what our right next step is. And so when we think about our emotional home, I think there's a lot of we can do about like setting the intention of like, okay, how do I want to show up today? What is it that I need to do? And again, even asking yourself, like, do I need solutions right now? Do I need comfort? And when we start to think about our emotional home, we recognize this is where we spend most of our time. We want to make sure that we're tending to and cultivating that emotional home. And if you need to think about, okay, well, there's certain places in your emotional home, the whole idea is it's what makes you feel the safest. And it doesn't even have to be the healthiest. It could be really maladaptive, but it's just like, you know what? Me being in that place of worry is just kind of what makes sense for me. But again, this is where we start to think about the big opportunity and the shift, right? This is when we start to think of the shift. And on that note of worrying, one of my bestest friends on the planet, his name's Peter Katz, he's a musician, he said to me the other day, he goes, Robin, worrying is praying for what you don't want to have happen. Worrying is praying for what you don't want to have happen. And I just, again, realized, like, okay, that's not really the kind of energy that we want to be thinking about when we think about our emotional homes, what that looks like. Now, how we can start to do some of this work, because I want to offer you some tools, we're going to talk a wee bit about some high-impact practices. What that means is that these are things that we've learned in the research actually help people feel better when they're going through a lot of challenging seasons and how they try to recalibrate to move forward. So the first one, again, I'm going to pause and ask you this question, and this is one of those ones you can kind of put in your back pocket and just think about it when you have a breath. You know, when do you feel the most effective in your roles? Is it when you have like 22 meetings back to back, there's no water source and you don't know where your next cup of coffee is coming from, and somebody's doing a performance review over your shoulder, right? Is that when people shine? No, right? It's one of those things, like, I literally think I forget how to spell if I ever have to spell something in front of other people, right? It's like, I am a competent adult. As soon as I have to write something on the board, I apparently forget how to spell, right? And even the other day, I was teaching, and I went to write something on the whiteboard, and I went like this, because I was like trying to like remember how to spell it, and one of my students says, "What is that?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm just trying to jog my memory on how to spell it." And they're like, "Is that like a wand?" And I'm like, "No, it's my cursive." And they're like, "Oh my gosh, when I have to try to spell a word, I do this." And I'm like, we are from different generations, right? But when we think about when do people feel the best, one of the variables, in a cluster analysis that we learned, it's people feel the most effective when they feel regulated, right? When they're grounded and steady, clear direction, know what's coming up. So how do we re-regulate a nervous system really quickly? Now, that kind of sounds a wee bit complex, but it's actually very straightforward. And the tool I'm going to share with you, I've used this with like CEOs and top executives, athletes, even astronauts, and toddlers. So if you find me a tool that works with all of that and we get the same results, it's something that has pretty high generalizability. And this tool is called birthday cake breathing. Have you heard of birthday cake breathing? Yeah? Okay, so anytime you need to re-regulate your nervous system, all you need to do in your mind's eye is imagine a birthday cake. Or I'm mindful birthday cakes are cultural, so anything hot, okay? So imagine, you don't even have to close your eyes. Hold a birthday cake in your mind. Take a deep breath in, and then blow out your birthday candles. You're one breath away from a regulated nervous system. Now, why that works is by holding an image in your mind's eye, it quiets all the mental chatter. Okay, you can't have competing thoughts when you're holding an image. And when you exhale, it sends a cue up your polyvagal nerve that says you're safe. And then you're in this really precious place where you're able to respond versus react. You're able to respond versus react. And where we get ourselves in a whole bunch of hot water is when we're reactive versus just taking that bit of a pause. Now, the next idea I want to share with you and what we're seeing in terms of where do we go forward is learning about the power of psychological safety. So once our physical needs are met, and then we can master our psychological needs, that's when we know people are able to hold hope and choose to believe that better days are ahead. And recently I was asked by someone, they said, Robin, I don't believe you can measure psychological safety. I took that as a challenge. And I said to this person, I said, can I ask your organization about their psychological safety with one question? And the person said yes. And I said, okay. And I asked this question, how do you feel on Sunday evenings? How you feel on Sunday evenings is very, very indicative of your level of psychological safety in the workplace. And what we know is that when we feel seen and heard, we are okay with Sunday nights. Yeah, sure, there might be a little bit of a ripple of like, oh wow, I got to go back to work and do that again for 42 years, right? Like there might be just an awareness pause, right? But for the people who feel like dread, right? For the people like that means that there's something that's in that environment and it's something that makes them feel at unease, right? There's something there, Sundays. And we especially see this with our Sunday scaries with kids in school, right? That they're scared of Mondays. Mondays are the most missed days in school, right? Why are Mondays so hard? Because children don't know what to expect. They get nervous that there's something happening. Mondays are tricky for some of us. So again, just even kind of knowing about what that looks like, it's data for us. Now, just so we're on the same page, psychological safety means that like we can be who we are, right? We have the freedom to be who we are. And I can share with you an experience I had with psychological safety many years ago. So Jax was, my youngest, was born, and he was born on Friday. I went back to work on Monday, but it was the end of the term, so that made sense. And I remember he was 6 weeks old at this point, a couple weeks later, obviously, and I got a call from the daycare. And the daycare said, you need to come pick up your kid. He's sick. Fair. So I went into my supervisor's office and I said, I need to leave to go collect Jax, and he's unwell at the daycare. They just called. And my supervisor said, does he know anyone else he can call? And I'm like, no, because he's a 6-week-old baby and he doesn't have friends yet. And his social circle is very small, and I am mom and I'm going to pick up my kid. And then there was this moment and my supervisor said, I knew this would never work, you having kids. And the amazing thing is, I already had 2 other ones that person apparently didn't know about, right? So, but I remember in that moment feeling this tug of war, where as long as I stayed in that place, I was going to feel as though I had to work as if I didn't have kids. But at home, I was feeling pressure by other people in the community that I was supposed to raise my children as if I didn't work outside of the home. Right? Like the good moms were doing these things, and then there was me over here, right? So it was just this idea of like, how do we mitigate, how do we reconcile these pulls? And when we're in tug of wars around our identity, we aren't able to achieve psychological safety. We actually have to live and honor the lived experience. Now, when we feel the most psychologically safe, we're around people who are accountable and have follow through, okay? People who are predictable make us feel safe. We also know that people who provide us clarity of what our roles are make us feel safe, what people expect of us. We also know that when we're part of community, we feel safe. And we also know there's this relationship with feedback. So for example, when somebody gives me feedback, I just decide that I don't like them anymore, right? Like that's literally my first response. I'm like, now I don't like you. I appreciate that is not a growth mindset, and that is not a lifeline learner type philosophy, but my little bruised ego will always come to my defense and be like, well, we didn't really like them anyway. Okay? So I've had a lot of experiences of not having really constructive feedback, so I didn't even really know how to have feedback. I just got defensive, and I know I'm not alone. Other people feel that too. So one of the ways to work with people like us to have psychological safety but still provide feedback is connect before you correct, right? Just take a minute to connect with that person before you correct them, and then we can hear, then we can listen. But if you just come in with instructions and corrections, I'm going to shut down. That's just a strategy that works for me. So again, understanding psychological safety is about having this kind of lived experience recognized. And it's also having the courage to intervene. We feel safe around people who stand up for what's right and what's true and what's just. Now, I'll share with you another kind of script. Let's say, for example, someone comes to you and they're going through something and they're looking for support. And what often happens is when somebody, let's say, comes into your office and they're crying, our first response is to say, don't cry, right? Or if a friend is worried about something, we're like, don't worry, right? Or if somebody's really angry, we tell them to calm down. Has that ever worked in the history of the world? Has anybody ever stopped you like, you are so right, I should birthday cake breathe and re-regulate, and I'll choose again, right? Like, when we tell people not to feel something, we actually feel it even more. So the alternative is similar to what we talked about at the beginning, but we use this 3-step process. If somebody's upset, acknowledge it. Say, hey, I see this is upsetting. Validate it. It's okay to be upset right now. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be scared or sad or worried. And then what we do is we offer 3 things that we can do for them in this moment. Hey, you know what? I can listen, we can go for a walk, or we can reschedule. And what the research shows is by giving people these 3 options, it's moving them from this place of feeling shame and overwhelm to a place of action. Now, you don't have to solve their problems. It's literally just setting people up so that way they can take that breath and their space is held for them to think what works best for them. Now, the other way we can do this is asking people, okay, before you get into telling me your story, do you want me to listen, offer advice, or do you need me to intervene? Now, what we see when we train this as a communication pattern, 97% of professionals say they just want their leader and their teammates to listen. And would you like to know what we do 86% of the time? We offer advice. We are so good at offering other people advice, even to the point people are telling us our problems. We've solved them in our head. Okay, now we just wait for them to stop talking, right? So we can then give them the solution, right? We're not even listening anymore, right? But the reality is people just need space to be held for them to actually be heard, right? And there's even research that shows if you want to be perceived by others as being a masterful listener, all you need to do is put down the cell phone. Research shows that if you go up to a colleague and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about something, and your response is you literally silence your phone and you put it away, they will report that you are literally the most gifted, talented listener they have ever seen in their life, simply by the action of shutting down the cell phone. But I'll tell you, it works opposite for teenagers, right? If you want to have a conversation with a teenager, really the research shows it needs to be ear to ear, and you have to actually make it look like you're kind of half not interested, okay? So I'll give you an example. I remember one time when Hunter was in grade 10, he came home and he's like, Mama, I met a girl at school, and I literally dropped everything, slapped the laptop, turned around, I'm like, Hunter, I've been waiting this for your whole entire life, let's work this out. And then he looked at me, he goes, you know what, I think I'm good. I think I'm good. And he walked out of the room, and I'm like, ooh, I didn't nail that one. And then I remember a wee while later, he came in, and I was in the kitchen, I was washing dishes, and he came in, he's like, yeah, so there's this girl at school, and I'm like, pretend I don't care. Pretend, and I literally was just washing the dish as if I was so, I'm like, oh yeah, so what's the big deal? So what? And he's like, well, and he started to talk, but it's this way of what feels safe, right? So for grown-ups and adults, it's deep attention. But for adolescents, it just needs to be casual, right? Just because they're not used to eye-to-eye contact. I remember even explaining to my children, you know, when I was your age, I actually had to call and talk to my friends' parents first to see if I could talk to Jillian. And they're like, you called the parents? I'm like, that's how it worked. And I would have to say, hello, Mr. Carr, may I please speak to Jillian? And he would say things like, how was your day at school, Robin? And then I would have to have a conversation with her dad while she was running down the stairs. And then the kids were just like, that would be way too awkward. I'm like, that is literally how we used to connect with our friends, right? So they're not used to that eye to eye. So again, ear to ear for now, we'll work them towards eye to eye. But right now, it's just ear to ear. Now, the other idea that I wanted to share with you, and I'm mindful of our time, so we have a few more ideas, and then we're going to go into questions. So please don't be shy. You're welcome to ask me anything. We'll get there in a few minutes. But I'm curious about what's your relationship like with rest and recovery? What's that relationship like for you? Like that estranged. Not positive, Robin. Yeah. Okay. Well, this was a common response that we saw, that people just weren't really good at resting. Have you ever noticed you're super busy and then all of a sudden you stop and all those pesky emotions start to surface and you're like, you know, I'm just going to go back to work, right? I don't want to deal with that, right? We stay busy enough because we don't want to deal with all the unprocessed emotion. But what we know is eventually that catches up to us, right? So we actually have to find ways to do rest and recovery. But then I got really curious during the last wee while about, okay, well, what's going to give me my best return on my investment? If I have to slow down, what's going to give me the best return on my investment? And I was talking to other people, I'm like, what's your rest and recovery behavior? And they would say things to me like, you know, Robin, at the end of the day, I've had such a busy day, my nervous system is fried, so I just feed the kids, put them to bed, and then I curl up and I watch a serial killer documentary, right? I watch some CSI, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, whew, okay, I feel better. I'm like, wow, right? What does that say about us that we literally curl up with violence as a way to recover? But there's a reason though, actually, there's no judgment, because this behavior actually makes sense. Because what happens is usually, let's take a good old CSI or Law and Order, right? What happens is you meet at a regular time, right? You get to control when it starts. And then you see a familiar cast of friends and characters. You know all their backstory, so you're in on the inner kind of conversation. And then there's a problem of practice. There's usually 1 or 2 interruptions, and then they solve it 42 minutes later, and Dick Wolf's name pops up, and then you're like, okay, the world's a good place, right? It gives us closure and predictability, because it actually finishes. It actually ends. Right? And that's what we're looking for, is we're just looking for closure, because nothing ever feels done. Nothing feels like we get there. We feel done, but it's not the type of finish and completion that we're seeking. So what actually helps? What will help us feel better? Now, this is what we found in our research. There were 5 things that we called the forces of recovery that actually help people feel better, and it lasts. The first one is solitude. Sometimes you actually need just a break, just stillness and quiet. I know a little while ago, Ava came in and she said, Mama, can I borrow this in your shower? And I'm like, yeah, go ahead. And she came back out and she's like, why was there a coffee cup in your shower? And I said, that's where I had my coffee this morning, dear. And she's like, oh my gosh, we were looking for you everywhere. I'm like, I know. I totally know, but I literally just needed a minute, sister. I just needed a minute. And she's like, oh, okay. Or if you've ever noticed, sitting in the driveway, when you pull in, you just take that little minute, right? And even the kids will look at the window like, are you coming in the house? And I'm just like, just getting ready, right? You just sometimes need just that little bit of solitude. And on the other side of it is connection. And it's the right type of connection. And I'll share with you my incident of connection recently. I was at Hunter's basketball tournament, and there was 2 games back to back, but I didn't know there was a break between the games. And so all the parents and the supporters were in the stands. And then during the break, all of these athletes came towards us. And I all of a sudden saw these parents, they pulled out coolers, and they pulled out homemade snacks. This one mother made fruit kebabs, but she put marshmallows on the end so the boys wouldn't poke themselves with the stick, right? There was a charcuterie board on the bench. Hunter gets to me. I literally, thank God, had this old granola bar in my backpack. It's the one that's in the bottom of your backpack. You have no idea how long it's been there. And I literally offered it to him. And he looked at this charcuterie board set up and these little marshmallows on the ends of fruit kebabs. And then he leaned and he goes, Mama, I would not have expected anything more from you. And I said, see, that's why we get along. And I took it as a compliment. But the best part was the woman sitting beside me, her son looked at my weary little granola bar, and then this mom handed her son her debit card. And I literally slid next to her and I said, my name is Robin, I would like to sit beside you for the rest of the season. And I said to her, because this is truth, if I would have left and only saw those parents, I would have left today thinking I did not do a good enough job. But because you are equally ill-prepared as I am, I feel like there's hope for us. And then we had a lovely conversation about why do we still need to bring snacks for 19-year-olds, right? So we were on the same level where we both agreed that we think 19 there should be a cutoff when you have to bring the bear paws and the goldfish to basketball. So we want to be careful of who we're comparing ourselves to. Because if we're comparing ourselves to people, even let's say in our jobs, who have 20 years experience, and you're looking at yourself being like, oh, why can't I do it the way they did it? I would hope that in 20 years you would do it like that. But you have to give yourself that kind of permission to get to that place, right? So we want to be careful who we compare ourselves to. The other one we talk about is the power of nature. As soon as you go outside, your mood will start to re-regulate. And the research shows it's as little as 15 minutes outdoors contributes to vitality. Just 15 minutes outside. And often when people say to me, Robin, I don't have time to go outside for a walk, then you need to go out for 2 walks, right? If you don't have time to do 1 walk, that means you actually need 2 walks. We actually need to get outside more. The other one we talk about is the power of music. Music is a remarkable mood agent. I was talking to a group of high school students. We were talking about like, hey, what kind of song just really kind of you get into your feels and it helps you feel better? And this one girl said to me, she's like, oh, have you heard the new Miley Cyrus song, Flowers? And I was like, yes. She's like, it's the ultimate revenge song. I'm like, sister, I grew up with Alanis Morissette. That is not a revenge song. I'm like, that is not a revenge song. There are other songs out there. But it's just this idea that like the right playlist, you can really use it to elevate or validate your mood, right? And music, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but using music is a really powerful agent to actually kind of help us kind of weather different emotions. And the other one we talk about is the power of gratitude. What you appreciate, appreciates. What you put your energy and your focus on, we know that grows. So again, even just sending that thank you text or that email to a colleague to say, hey, thanks for showing up for work today. It was really great to sit beside you during Georgian days. Whatever that might be, we actually know that when we end on that positive note, it makes us feel better. So one of the things that we do in psychology, one of my kind of strategies that I love is it's called habit stacking. Now, habit stacking is when you want to learn a new behavior and you stack it on a habit you already have. And I can tell you one of my go-to habit stacking strategies always will revolve around a cup of coffee, right? So literally I'm holding a cup of coffee and I look at this magic bean water and I'm like, these are all the things I'm grateful for. And what I've associated is anytime I have a cup of coffee, I just think of what are 3 new things that I am grateful for in this moment, right? You can actually create these little sacred moments and all of the world can be busy and noisy and you can be anywhere just having this little moment, right? Or maybe if you have your emotional support water bottle, right? Have you seen people who travel with their emotional support water bottles, right? And like literally put those stickers on so you can just like have a little moment, right? Little kind of positive affirmation. And you can create these little rituals. And what the research shows is it's actually enough. It's actually enough to help us set ourselves up for success. Now, the last big idea that I want to share with you is about the practice of lighthousing. Okay, now lighthousing in my research is also the area that's called integration. Integration is when we brave and weave all of it together. Now, the reason we call this lighthousing is lighthouses are my favorite structures on the planet. Wherever I go in the world, I always try to find the lighthouse because to me it symbolizes guidance, clarity, and like this purpose, right? A lighthouse has a very clear purpose. It does not chase boats. It literally does not chase a boat. It literally stands in its own way and just helps where it can. Now, the reason I love the lighthouse as well is my family actually immigrated to Canada from Scotland, and my grandfather did a transatlantic voyage, and he wrote about how significant it was to be on this Atlantic passage, feeling deep fear about the uncertainty of what was ahead in a new country. He was overwhelmed by all of it until he saw the lighthouse in Prince Edward Island. And as soon as he saw the lighthouse, he just had this sense that all would be well. And as we boldly go into these futures that we are co-creating, we want to make sure we're setting ourselves up with these guideposts, this confidence that all is going to be well. Now, the way we do that in psychology for integration is called maxim formation. It's the way we train our brain to perceive and see challenges. And the one I want to leave with you today is this idea that I can do hard things. I want you to believe in your bones that you can do hard things. We will go to extraordinary lengths in the human condition to avoid hard things. We will put off difficult conversations. We will go out of our way to make sure we're not in a place of discomfort, though we carry all of that heavy emotional labor for so longer than we need to, okay? But what happens when we actually show up into those hard places or those hard seasons or those difficult conversations, we realize what we need to probably be doing is just on the other side of it. But we actually have to go through it. Now, where this idea that I can do hard things came from was actually my mom. When I was a little girl, she used to always say, Robin can do hard things. And I had zero idea what that woman was talking about. But she would always say that. And again, when I was little, I didn't understand. But when I was a teenager, I can do hard things actually saved my life. Now, I'll tell you with some pretty radical candor
that when I was a teenager, I was in a very dark season. By grade 10, I had dropped out of high school. I was a terrible student. My teachers in grade 8 said they wished there was a level below basic or trades that I could study because I would never amount to anything and I was wasting everyone's time. And they said, like, nobody cares. Nobody cares. You are not a student. And so by grade 10, I dropped out. And in that season, my mental health got really, really complicated, and I developed a lot of addictions, and I was in a really precarious place. Now, my parents loved me hard, but helplessly. They had no idea how to support me. Now, they had one child who was soaring, who grew up in the same household, and I was self-destructing. And after I was hospitalized numerous times, finally my mom came in and she did something pretty radical. She said, "Our family's moving." And I said, "Why are we moving?" And my mother said, "It's because you need a fresh start and a second chance, and you'll never get that here. So our family, we're going to stand by you and we're going to find you a new beginning." So my family left Toronto and they moved to just north of Peterborough, and I started to get better. I was making plans to go back to school, I was sober, I was doing the work, and I eventually got my driver's license, which is such a big deal to have my driver's license, and I had it for 1 week. Yeah, you know where this is going. Had that driver's license for 1 week, and I was driving home late at night by myself, and a snowstorm rolled in. And within moments, I lost control of that car. And the car slid off the road, down an embankment, and my vehicle crashed through the ice, and my vehicle sank in the Otonabee River with me trapped inside. Within seconds, this frigid cold water came rushing through the floorboards, and I was drowning, entombed in my car. And in that moment, I recognized that I wasn't feeling scared. I wasn't feeling afraid. I noticed I was feeling angry. And I was angry that I could not protect my mom from what was going to happen. I was okay to die. I was not okay with what that would do to my mom. But when I started to think about my mother, it was like this old emotional echo almost. It was a feeling where my mother would say, "But Robin, you do hard things." And I thought if I could just somehow show her that I didn't give up, that I had tried to survive, that maybe could bring her some comfort in her road ahead. So I tried to wiggle out of the seatbelt. I couldn't get the seatbelt off, so I wiggled out of the seatbelt. And at this point, the vehicle already was starting to crush because of the water pressure. And I'll tell you, crushing metal underwater is a horrific sound. And I couldn't open the car door, but I was able to put my fingertips where the window met the door and pull hard enough on the window to slide it down the track, and I was able to swim out through the window. Now I got to the other side, but I couldn't tell which way was up or down. They estimate the vehicle was about 20 feet underwater, and it was just churning in this current. So in that moment, the only thing I could think of was to exhale, because I knew my bubbles would rise. And I remember swimming after those little air bubbles as hard as I could, with winter boots on, jeans, and a big winter coat. And there was this moment where I actually felt this little surge that, whoa, I might actually get out of this. And then all of a sudden, smash, something hit my face so hard, and I realized my face was banging against this thick layer of ice on top of the river. Now, the car had crashed a hole farther downstream, but now I was down here, and it was frozen over. And in that moment, it was just a scramble, anything I could do to try and get out. Now, I was able to get to the middle of the channel where the water was traveling faster and the ice was thinner, and I was able to break through the ice, and I was holding the edge of the ice in the middle of the night on this deserted road in a blizzard. And that night, there was a gentleman by the name of Joseph. His name was Joseph Todd. He was just a random guy in his 30s driving home from shift work. And Joseph just happened to see my car tracks in the snow and he just happened to drive all along the side of that road to see if he could see anyone. He sees me out there on the ice somehow. He pulls over his pickup truck. He grabs wood and a chain from the back of his pickup truck. He uses the wood to make an X to support his body weight. And Joseph crawled out onto that ice, slid out the chain, wrapped it around my body, and he dragged me to shore. Joseph Todd was awarded the Governor General's Award for bravery, for risking his life to save a stranger. And a wee while later, I woke up in the hospital, and my mom was there. And my mother asked me, Robbie, how did you do it? How did you get yourself out of that predicament? And I said to my mom, it's very much because you told me I could do hard things. And my mom leaned in really close and said, that's not really what we ever had in mind when we told you. But I'm glad it worked in your favor. Now, a wee while ago, I was presenting to some students at an elementary school, and there was like 700 of them in the auditorium, and this one little boy stood up mid-story and yelled, "But did you die?" I was like, no, little one, I did not die. But it was very much the origin story as to why I choose to study human resiliency. Because I do believe in the human condition. I believe in second chances. I believe that even in our darkest hours, we can find our way through. We will find our way through, and I don't think we're meant to do it alone. So whenever I do my work, I make sure to give recognition and thanks to Joseph Todd, because I don't think any act of bravery should be forgotten. We need to have more of these conversations about our heroes. And something else that I've learned, and I see this each and every day in post-secondary, is like, yeah, we do hard things, and we support students who are doing hard things in community. But when we come together, it's pretty obvious that we can do some pretty great things as well. So for all the great things that you have been doing here at George, and I do just want to hold space to say thank you for your service. It matters, and this work matters. So thank you, merci miigwech, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Robin.
You're welcome, Shannon.
I really appreciate this notion of co-creating our future, navigating change together, and the caring and comforting team that we have here at Georgian is a great grounding in belonging and perspective, and moving forward with hope. So I'm sure many of you have questions for Robin, and so we will have some microphones that will come through the audience, and so if you'd like to ask a question, we'll just get started, and I'll ask one to get us rolling. So what advice might you offer college leaders or team members to help foster resilient teams with a hope-filled perspective?
I appreciate that question. So how do we cultivate this idea of being hope-filled, especially in teams? I think what a starting point is when we do our updates, asking people like, what's going well? What's working versus kind of always looking at it from a kind of problem solution, which, and I know we have to look at the problems and solutions, but just really capturing the things that are working out. And like, tell us your updates, tell us 2 things that you're pleased about this week, and tell us a good news story. Like those things really, really matter. And again, if you think about that, our brain, when it hears good news stories, what it does is it reminds us of other good news stories. We get those hits of dopamine and that serotonin. When we talk about negativity, it just starts to create this heaviness. So bringing in dialogue around those things that are uplifting and positive, that are working, sharing success stories, some of those little wins in the classroom, talking about that in our teams, like having that as that kind of starting point that, we are doing great work, and yeah, there's still some things that we're going to figure out, but we want to capture the wins, I think, is a starting place.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It reminds me of my daughter, and when instead of saying what's new, she asks what's good.
Yes. Coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee is so good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Awesome.
I can't see if anyone has questions for Robin.
Yeah.
Is there-
Please don't be shy. You're welcome to ask me anything.
Quiet.
Oh, that's an interesting question. What's the most surprising thing I have seen in our research? There's a lot of them, I could say. There's lots of surprises. I think the biggest one was, I just remember like when I first got into resiliency, realizing that it was actually accessible, that more people could be more resilient, but people wouldn't use that language to describe themselves as resilient, yet they were resilient. So just realizing it wasn't this like Herculean strength that certain people were born with, realizing that kind of each and every day what we do actually sets us up. That was definitely this big turning point when I started to think about it differently. Recently, I can share with you one of the things that was so surprising in the last year that we came across was the power of music. And I mean that in a sense of, we always kind of think about like, the academy and it's like, it's problem solving, it's critical thinking, it's logic. And one of the ways that we can like kind of open people's hearts up again and help people feel brave and courageous and like take risks, we can actually cultivate some of those skills through music. And I think sometimes music gets kind of, overlooked, right? It doesn't get the same kind of recognition as some of the sciences, for example, but the arts is definitely where people are finding a lot of healing. And actually one of that colleague I shared, my best friend Peter, we talk about that actually, we have a podcast, and that's one of the things that we just talk about so much is that we need the arts so much because that's really what's facilitating healing in a pretty significant way. And again, we're one song away from feeling better, right? One song can totally change the course of your day. So thank you for asking.
I think there's a question in the back.
Thank you for sharing your story with us.
You're welcome.
That, I think, brings a lot of power. And besides role modeling or maybe sharing the practical tools, how can we inspire resilience in others, or students maybe more in particular?
Yeah, great question again, and thank you for your kind remarks. We need to be champions for them. Sometimes it's, we don't see it as a person who's struggled through learning challenges and different experiences. I'm an adult with ADHD, with learning disabilities, and all the way along I was told that I wasn't a student, right? I wasn't going to be a good student. And it wasn't until I started hearing other narratives to correct that, where people were like, no, I expect you to be able to figure this out. I believe that you could figure this out. It's giving people like a challenge to rise to that's within a scope that's possible for them, right? Like letting them say like, okay, you know what, maybe we can't do this whole project, but I know you can do the first part. Like show me you can do the first part, and just really letting them see that kind of scaffolded approach and how they problem solve. And the other one is to really highlight to students their transferable skills. And I think that's one of the ones that so often gets overlooked, right? That they and I'll hear them say things like, obviously I'm a bit biased with the math, but I'll hear them say things like, I'm not a math person. It's like, really? So if you have money in your pocket and you go to a store to order food, can you figure out if you have enough money to buy food? They're like, well, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, then you're a math person, right? Like, when you see it's -5 out, do you wear shorts? Well, okay, so you're a math person because you understand temperature, and those are numbers, right? So helping them see their transferable skills, and especially if we can capture it in something that they traditionally wouldn't see as transferable. So like figuring out like what their hobbies are, what their interests are, and like letting them say, hey, oh, really, you play sports? Okay, well, did you know this about this? Like these are ways that we can bring that into the classroom. Then they can actually have kind of almost like a place where they have their own knowledge set, right? And letting them feel that they're masterful at something, right? I think that's one of the ways we can start for our students, but hold them accountable, right? And that's, I think, sometimes when we see students that are struggling, we're just like, okay, well, we'll just kind of like not push them too much. We won't challenge them too much. It's like, no, we have to say, hey, I believe in you. And you might have been coasting for the last few years. You're not going to do that in my class because I know what you're capable of because you're here. And the fact that you've navigated what you've navigated and you're here tells me that you're resilient. So that's kind of where I would start. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Other questions? I think there's one in the middle.
The veriest middleist. Literally the veriest middleist. I love it.
Hi, Robin.
Hi.
You talked about a person's, I believe you called it emotional home.
Yes.
where there's anger or worrying, do you come across a lot of people that manage to successfully change their emotional home?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So one of the things that we know, the biggest kind of starting point for a shift or a change in emotional home is actually awareness. So often this is happening on like a subconscious level that people are just on autopilot. They just notice like they're a worrier and they just never really kind of challenged it before. So step number one, as soon as people just see that, like, wow, I notice, right? I'm noticing that's kind of what I gravitate to. I notice I'm somebody who kind of leans this way. That is a powerful first step. And then the next step is intention setting of like, I want to be a person who. Right? I want to be a person who, isn't, feeling fearful about change, or I want to be a person who can see challenges as like a sign of practicing bravery, right? Like we can kind of condition ourselves to view it differently. I think one of the things that sometimes where folks get stuck with an emotional home is that they start to put labels on it, where they're like, oh, this is a bad emotional home, or this is a good emotional state. The reality is every behavior we have ever done serves a purpose. And some of them are a bit more maladaptive, sure, and some of them are more adaptive, but all of it makes sense when you look at the big picture, right? So when we zoom out and we look at your emotional home, it will totally make sense as to what you needed to get through every season in your life. But what's really great is that that's that co-creation place where you can say, okay, from this point forward, I'm choosing to be a person who does this. And that's how we start to make that shift. But yeah, it's absolutely possible. And the gentle reminder, though, is when we're in seasons of stress, we'll always regress back to our emotional home, right? And that's okay. But then we know how to find strategies to rebuild and recommit. And the walk back to our new emotional home is not usually as far. You're welcome.
Hi, Robin.
Hi.
First of all, I want to thank you for doing hard things.
Thank you.
By doing hard things, you've created a platform for many. You've inspired all of us, I'm sure.
Thank you.
And the question that I have is a bit on me personal side.
Sure.
But, I heard you speaking in your presentation and the conversations that you have with your children. Like, it just seems so different and, so nurturing. And I just wanted to know, like, what influenced your parenting style?
Oh, I appreciate that question. So, I think what has probably been one of the greatest influences in my parenting style is, so when I was a student, as an undergrad, I studied attachment theory and was able to identify pretty early on in my parentinghood journey that as somebody who was, the attachment theory was introduced by Bowlby and Ainsworth, and the Canadian scholar who studies it is Kim Bartholomew out at UBC, and Simon Fraser, sorry, she said Simon Fraser now, but it's this idea that our early primary attachments to our attachment figure is going to really impact future relationships, and there's secure and dismissing and avoidant, there's all these different types, and I knew I was preoccupied, right? So that means I have a really high view of others and a very low view of self. Like that was just the reality of how I kind of came into my world. And knowing when I went into my parenting is that I wanted to set up the children that they had an equal positive view of others and positive view of themselves, right? So I wanted them to have a voice. I wanted them to be able to, ask for what they need. When I was growing up, it was kind of that, like, I guess the way to summarize it the most is one of the lessons I picked up, and it was, I had loving, devoted parents, but somewhere along the line, very early in my life, I picked up this idea that I needed to be easy to love. And I wanted the kids to know that they didn't need to be easy to love, and they were allowed to be who they were as people, and I would figure it out as their mom. I would figure out a way to connect with them, and they didn't have to be easy to love. And so what that meant is be somebody who felt that they always had to be easy to love. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be making fuss. I didn't want to make a noise. I didn't want to put anyone out because I felt that's how I would be rejected, right? That's how I'd be abandoned. So I tried to always follow the line. And I did that for so long to eventually I had no idea who I was at 16, right? I was just absolutely so lost. And so for me, with my parenting approach, it was wanting the kids to know that I believe in unconditional love only between a parent and a child, and that I was going to be their champion no matter what. And actually, it's really funny. Hunter, my oldest, so he's a basketball player. That's his primary sport. And he came home a few weeks ago, and he said or I guess it was a month ago now, he came home and he said, I'm going to Scotland, Mom. And I'm like, oh, tell me more about this. And he's like, yeah, I made the rugby team, and I'm going to Scotland. Going to Scotland, they needed players. And I'm like, dude, you have never played rugby a day in your life. And he's like, how hard could it be? I'm like, really effing hard, Hunter, really effing hard, like really hard. And he's like, I'll figure it out. How hard can it be? And I was just like, and I actually said to him, like, where did that come from? He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, you literally were born with this kind of thought of like, how hard could it be? And he's like, Mom, you're like, you'll never let anything bad happen to me. I'm like, bad things happen all the time. He's like, yeah, and you'll do stuff to help me out, Mom. He's like, I'll be fine. And he's like, I was like, okay. He's like, okay, really? He's like, Mom, if I'm in Scotland and I need money, could you get money to me? I'm like, yes. He's like, do I have health insurance? I'm like, yes. He's like, and if worse came to worse, could you like Liam Neeson me out of there? I'm like, no, this is not taken, and I do not have skill sets. And he's just like, funny. He's like, because I think you could. He's like, I'm fine. And I'm like, where did you come from? He's like, Mom, and I always told my kids when they were little, I said, I love you more than evolution requires me to, right? I will be that champion for you. And even times when, they would come home and they'd be like, oh, everybody is doing this. Am I allowed to do it? And I would be like, no, you're not doing that. And they're like, oh, well, Jill's mom's letting her. And I would say to Ava, well, clearly I love you more than Jill's mom. Then Jill's mom loves her, right? So we always kind of had that kind of open kind of idea that we're home team no matter what, right? And even, I remember even my husband used to say to me, and he says to me all the time, he's like, it's never, Jeff versus Robin, it's always Robin and Jeff versus the problem, right? And it's always the kids and mom versus the problem, right? So we're never not on the same team. We can view things differently, but we're always on the same team. We have each other's back. So I really think that when kids can grow up in that secure environment, that they, no matter what, it really changes the game for them. So thank you for asking. There you go. And he did just fine, by the way, in Scotland. He got 2 tries, and he came back, and he's like, see, it wasn't that hard. Yeah, there you go.
Is there another question for Robin?
Yeah, I can probably.
I think the team that I'm on, and thank you.
You're welcome.
For all of this. I think we're really fortunate, the team that we work together on. We gel together, and you just use the phrase the whole team.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I'm thinking is to put that into action if you find yourself leading or just a part of a team or a department that doesn't have that whole team feel. What's job one? What's your first step to start?
Yeah, great question. So just to reframe it for folks, it's like, how do we build like team cohesion and that sense of belonging with a team that might not have it? Is that fair? Yeah. So I think what's so important is to first start with intention setting, right? Like we're setting the intention that given that you are grown-ups and you will spend, this is kind of always my like hook onto how I bring people into the power of collaboration and belonging in workplaces. As grown-ups, you will spend more of your time awake in your adult life with these people than you will with your own family. Like, this is where you are going to make up the majority of your time. We want to make sure that it's productive, healthy, and successful, right? So this idea that this is, we don't want to white knuckle our jobs to live for our weekends and our evenings. It's like, this is where you're spending your best energy. And if you do this right in collaboration and community, then you're going to have more energy for your family and your community outside of the job, right? So it's building kind of almost that kind of a reasoned approach. So this isn't like, oh, it's a work family because that's kind of feels good and we're going to do like birthdays on Fridays. Like that, like, no, maybe if you want to celebrate birthdays on Fridays, that's great. But it's this idea that like we need to have relationships because these are the people we spend the majority of our time with. And this is going to have a huge indicator on our health if it's actually not good. And unfortunately, especially with what kind of the changing in the workforce in the last wee while is people have become so transactional in the workplace where it's literally like emails and meetings and it's just transactional and we've lost some of the relationship. So we actually have to put some energy back into that. But again, to let them know it's because when people feel better in work, they're actually better parents, they're better partners, they're better community members. They have higher acts of service when they're happy in their roles. And this is where you're going to spend the most of your time. So let's have a good time doing it, right? So that intention setting, that awareness building. And then the other thing that I think is really important is to ask your team, what does a safe, welcoming, and productive workplace look like? What does a safe, welcoming, productive workplace look like? And then you'll get lots of ideas how people will share. And then your follow-up question is, what are you personally doing to contribute to a welcoming, safe, and productive work environment, right? So it's getting to that place where we're all on the same page, and where it's not competition, it's collaboration. That I think is kind of a starting point. You're very, very welcome. Congratulations on your award.
I think this will be
You're
our
welcome.
last
Oh, this is
question.
the last.
I think so.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I feel like I'm one of those people who needs to get out for 2 walks a day, like you
Yes.
said. Like I'm busy all the time. I'm like I don't have enough time just in my life and whatever.
Yes.
And so I was really struck by your comment earlier about, you know, the time you spend outside your values.
Yes.
You know, you're headed more toward burnout.
Yes.
So please save me.
Yes. 100%. Yes.
No. But seriously though, I'd love to. You've suggested lots of great ideas here. I'm wondering maybe if you could suggest, you know, even maybe a first step or something to maybe taking a slow down and really thinking about your values and where to begin that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and you're not alone. And it was a brave question, so thank you. Somebody go for a walk with her during the day. Invite her. So I think first and foremost, it's the clarity of knowing what our values are. Right, and what is like, and we often talk about this in the work around, like, we can ream off values off the top of our head, but like, what are like the real values? Like, what is it that you really, really value, and getting that clarity, and then actually making sure that it's somehow in your day, right? Like, we don't want to save our values for just weekends when it's convenient, right? Like, we want our values to permeate everything that we do. So again, just clarity of knowing what matters most and making it matter most and bringing it top of mind. The other one is, I can share with you, often we fall into this trap that we call the when-then myth. So the when-then myth is this: once I get all my work done, then I'm going to go for that walk. Once I get, if I could, just get that one contract, then I'm going to not feel scarcity and shortage and fear in my entrepreneurial life, right? Once I get this, then I'm going to be okay. And the reality, even where we are today, if we just hold space to recognize, like, there was a season in your life where you like wished or prayed or worked for what you have right now in this moment. You were just like, oh, if I could just get there, right? If I had just had a reliable car, then I am fearless, right? We put all these measuring pieces, and my invitation for us is recognize that, like, then never actually comes. There'll always be something else. So it's that idea about prioritizing the values. And what's really, I find refreshing, is that when you start holding those value statements, and like real genuine value statements, it is actually silently giving permission for other people to do it too. So saying things like, oh, you know what, I don't book, meetings at 8 o'clock on Monday mornings because that's mean, right? And you'll just be like, no, like, I want to give people a chance to like settle into their work week. I want them to have a chance to kind of get their head in the game, and we don't book meetings until 1 o'clock, for example, on Mondays. Again, then other people are like, oh, well, that seems humane and practical, and it gives other people kind of conversation points, right? About, again, if you have a Monday morning team meeting, I'm not dissing your team meeting, but I hope it's a huddle and somebody brings snacks, right? Just because, again, it's like when we live in our values and we hold that, it actually gives other people permission to do it as well, and that makes a big difference. But again, that clarity of knowing what is it that matters most. I think that's a starting point. And just so you know, you're not alone. So many of us are so conditioned in that cycle of busyness. And I'll share with you personally, for the longest time, the only 2 emotions that I would ever let myself feel was productive or exhausted. And if I wasn't productive or exhausted, I didn't have a good day. And then I realized that's a really hard measuring stick to measure success on, right? So again, learning how we reframe and revisit it as often as we need to. So, beautiful. Thank you. Shannon, thank you.
Dr. Henley Dufault, thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Robin. We'll just be a couple minutes in closing here, and we'll get everyone on to the rest of the day. Robin, I just have to say, wow. You'll see why I'm a Robin fan. I've heard Robin speak several times, and every time I learn something new and something more that I can take into my own personal and professional life. And there are a lot of tips that you share that I do try to practice. I'm not perfect at it, but I'm working away, and I think you've shared some really important insights to all of us. So I really want to thank you. I want to thank all of you who are here and watching live stream for joining us this afternoon, and for those that did step up to ask some thoughtful questions. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So today really was a celebration of achievements, obviously an opportunity to cultivate connections, and I know there was great buzz at lunch hour over in the Peter B. Moore building, so I hope you had a chance to enjoy that for those on campus, and a chance to reflect on the promise and potential our future holds. And certainly Robin did talk about hope, and thank you for the license that hope is a strategy, because those that know me, I do, while I practice all 5 elements of resiliency, the 2 you'll see most from me is hope and humor. I do practice the other 3, but they're more internal, and you don't see that quite as much. And what Robin didn't share, and there is a connection here, is Robin also found a path to post-secondary education through college at St. Lawrence College, which is also, and I know you shared some fascinating stories, but also a wonderful story about the importance of the work we all do to help students access education. Of course, Robin's taken it from there and went on to do lots of great things. The connection there is the president of St. Lawrence College, some of you may know Glenn Vollerbreck, is a Georgian grad. And what Glenn and I both hold very dearly is we're both, all 3 of us are college grads. Glenn and I are both diehard Leafs fans. So with that becomes this, I'm very hopeful for tonight, trust me. I had to really work hard not to put the jersey on today. I felt for the board awards and other reasons I shouldn't wear my jersey today, but I can't make any promises for Thursday. But we are eternal optimists, and we hope. So that's my connection there. So with Team Georgian, again, thank you all. And I know with us working together, we know what our mission is, and you're living it every single day and helping our students, whether it's to access education, to further their education, to succeed, to overcome a challenge in a variety of ways. And each and every one of you do that. And with that, I have immense hope, to bring it back, and I truly do. Hope and pride in this organization because of the great work all of you do. I do want to remind you there's lots of other activities taking place during Georgian Days, including our Focus on Teaching conference, which will kick off tomorrow. And then on Friday, we have our Employee Long Service recognition event. Friday is also, as May 5th, is Red Dress Day, and we have a series of events happening. So I hope you will join us on campus for those important events and reflections as well. You can find all the details as well as links to watch live stream on the employee portal. Robin, thank you again. Just an honor to have you here. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Have a wonderful afternoon. Chi miigwech. Thank you.